Hi everybody, TheHande here, and today I decided let's do something a little bit different. Is this a shitty couch vlog? Is this a game review? It's actually both, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the ToeJam and Earl series. Originally created by JDP, then later known as ToeJam and Earl Productions, and now the series is under Human Nature. So what is ToeJam and Earl? Well, they originally had their beginnings on the Sega Mega Drive, in a little game called ToeJam and Earl. ToeJam and Earl are extremely funky aliens from the planet Funkotron, and in the very first game, you are trying to collect the pieces of their spaceship and trying to help them go back to the planet Funkotron. Now what makes this game very interesting for its time is that despite having large, very interesting levels, it's also a game where they intentionally made it so that the locations of items and enemies as well as objects in the game are randomized. That's if you pick the randomized version of the game at the very beginning. You get to choose whether to play as either ToeJam and Earl. You can find Christmas presents all around the level. Each of them have either some useful items or, in some cases, just total bummers, like a present that will kill you instantly. You travel around trying to find pieces of your spaceship before going all the way to level 25. Yes, there's only a set number of levels in this game. And what's interesting is that you can actually fall off a level into the previous level. The soundtrack is really cool, laid back, and features very, very good funk music. I wouldn't say the game's soundtrack is necessarily on the level of something like Sonic the Hedgehog, but it does use the hardware really well. There's also really funny sound effects. The character design and the art direction in this game is really hilarious, which is why I like it. Now the gameplay is a bit slow paced, and having those useful items is really necessary because both ToeJam and Earl move very slowly and aren't able to outrun most of the enemies, on top of which some of the terrain actually slows you down. Because of the randomized nature of the game, it can be sometimes kind of grueling difficult. And there's no passwords or anything like that, so it is a game you have to finish in a single sitting, unless you're playing one of the newer versions, such as the one on the Sega Mega Drive Classics collection. But I think it's a very enjoyable game. I really dig the chill atmosphere of it. To be fair, I think the controls could be a little better, and the menu system isn't entirely intuitive in my opinion. On your average scale, I would say this is about a 3.5 star game. But if you really like a chill game to mellow out to, I think this game is at least a 4-star affair in that sense. Now there was a second game on the Sega Mega Drive which was called In Panic on Funkotron. And this game took a very different direction from its predecessor. It isn't really the same kind of exploration survival title like the previous game. It's very much more a traditional side-scrolling platformer. The plot of this game picks up immediately after the events of the previous one, with some of the Earthlings having followed ToeJam and Earl on their spaceship, and are now causing havoc on Funkotron. So your mission in this game is to explore the levels to find a set number of humans, trap them in small bottles, and then send them back to Earth. Now, Planet Funkotron was featured in the final end sequence of the first game, and this entire game is set entirely on Funkotron. And this time there actually is a password system. On top of which the levels don't randomize like they used to. There are still a lot of different secrets and things hidden in the levels, so the exploration element isn't completely gone. Now, if I have one gripe about this game, it definitely is the play control. I'm saying the play control of the first game wasn't perfect, but because of the chill atmosphere of the game, I felt it was appropriate. In this game, I think that jumping is a little floaty, and the controls aren't necessarily as precise as I'd expect them to be, but I do also have to admit that compared to the previous game, they are a lot more self-explanatory, so I can't complain too much. On top of which, the art direction with the hand-animated sprites is just amazing, and I actually think the music sounds better than in the first game. As well, the first game had a lot of funny sound bites. This game has a much more varied and interesting selection of noises for your ears to enjoy. So from the presentation point of view, ToeJam and Earl 2 is absolutely superior to the first game. However, I do personally prefer the playstyle of the original. There's nothing wrong with ToeJam and Earl 2, and I do have to say compared to a lot of platformers, because, well, there were a lot of platformers on this particular platform, ToeJam and Earl 2 is actually kind of novel and has its own thing going. And I won't deny, this has to be one of the best looking and sounding Sega Mega Drive games out there. So for that, I do think it deserves its 4-star rating, but I stress that I do prefer the first game. Now there was a long gap in the series between the second and third game, which was called ToeJam and Earl Mission to Earth, and it went back more to the style of the first game, and also featured a new playable character. I don't have this game, so sorry, can't review it. But I do have ToeJam and Earl Back in the Groove, which came out this year in 2019. ToeJam Back in the Groove was a crowdfunded game that was already supposed to come out in 2016, but there was some shenanigans with the game publisher, so eventually it only came out this year. But it is by the original creators of ToeJam and Earl, and it goes back to the style of the first game, which you might have gathered made me really interested in this game. Just like the first game, it has a set of 25 levels, which you can play in either fixed or randomized versions, and the goal is essentially the same, except this time ToeJam and Earl accidentally break up their own spaceship while going back to Earth. Now, if I have any real big complaints about Back in the Groove, I think it's the presentation, and you will notice that all the characters in this game are 2D sprites, which is kind of cool, but the art aesthetic this time reminds you of those old Flash games from years ago, which unfortunately gives the game a very cheap look. And I say unfortunately because I would argue this game is actually superior to the original. Now, I do think it's kind of dumb how none of the items in the game world really stop the enemies, but there are other ways to dupe them and avoid them. The biggest improvement over the original game, in my view, is the play control. Now, not only do you have multiple characters you can choose from, and with differing stats that actually improve as the game goes on. In the original game, when you kind of leveled up, you only got an extra life and some additional length to your life bar. In this game, all the characters just move a lot faster. It's a lot easier to avoid enemies. I feel that there's a lot more useful items that you can use to avoid enemies, such as a power-up that makes you invisible, the tomatoes, which actually now do shit, and there's also a lot more nice NPCs. There were some in the first game as well. The music is a mix of new beats and also classic ToeJam and Earl music, now played with real instruments. And a lot of the enemies from the first two games actually make a return, as well as Letitia from ToeJam and Earl 3. Also, you have new terrains that weren't seen in the first game, and I particularly like the ice levels in this one because you can slide on the frozen bodies of water. And even in the normal levels, moving around in water is a lot more helpful because that's the easiest way you can usually outrun enemies. And there is a hard mode, and I will stress that it is really hard. Even though the game allows you to save your progress, the save only lasts until you come back to the game. So, just like the original, you're still expected to finish the game on a single playthrough, which I personally find is actually a lot easier to do because of the improved gameplay and also the fact that I think a lot of the levels are a lot smaller than in the original game, which I don't mind. There's still a lot to explore, and I think there's a much heavier emphasis on avoiding enemies. I think a lot of people might find the original ToeJam and Earl a little too slow-paced, so I think that's the #1 thing Back in the Groove actually fixes. Now, I will also admit that in the randomized mode, the game just kind of spreads out items around the level. Some of them will start looking like a bit of a clusterfuck, especially in hard mode. But I think what Back in the Groove does well is that it retains what made the original so entertaining and fun, and adds its own little spice to it. So for its overall improvements and, I would say, fun factor, I think this game deserves a 4.5 stars out of 5. It does suffer in the presentation a little bit. I'm not a particular fan of the cutscene animations, for instance, but it's a very enjoyable game. That's all from me for now. I'm TheHande, and see you on the next one.